And you know, the behaviorists got an awful long way with their idea of the animal as a sort of simple stimulus response machine, and that's partly because of this hierarchy that we're describing, you know, because you can treat an animal as if it's a pretty simple machine because it has all that simple machinery in it. It's just that on top of that simple machinery there's a lot more complex machinery, and so, but the simple machinery does a lot more than people generally think, and can do more than people think. And so the fact that there are these at least two projections, they branch more than that, gives you right away a sense of why the behaviors could have been right, and the cognitive psychologists could have been right, and even the psychodynamic thinkers can be right, because they're analyzing the system at different levels of hierarchical complexity and extracting out slightly different, what would you call, observations. And some of these things are, even like the simpler systems can have quite complex outputs. So one of the things that the simpler sensory motor system does is detect snakes, because primates don't like snakes. In fact, there's a woman named Lynn Isbell wrote a nice book on primate vision and snakes, and she was very curious about why human beings could see so well. And she also noticed that we're very good at detecting the sort of camouflage patterns that snakes use, especially in the lower half of our visual field. And she did this cross-cultural survey around the world and found out that where there's more predatory snakes, the primates have better vision. So we sort of co-evolved with snakes, and snakes gave us vision, just like it says in Genesis, which is pretty damn funny as far as I'm concerned. And it was snakes in trees even, so, and fruit of course gave us color vision. So the whole Genesis story nailed it pretty well. But you know, snakes have been around long enough and have been our enemy, or say predatory reptiles, you know, if you don't really want to go with the whole snake thing, that we've evolved, we've co-evolved with them. It's like 60 million years. It's a very, very long period of time. So Darwin used to amuse himself in a Darwinian way. He'd go to there was a zoo or a place that shows reptiles. I don't remember what they're called, but they had one glass cage where there was some kind of poisonous snake. I think it was a cobra, and Darwin would put his face right up against the glass, and the cobra would go whack, and he'd jump back. And he did that many times because he was curious about whether or not he could actually bring the snake avoidance reflex under conscious control, and he couldn't. Every time the snake jumped, he'd jump backwards. He couldn't control it. And so that's because all the primates that could control it, when there were snakes biting them, are dead. So Darwin was the beneficiary of the Darwinian process in that sense. So the point is, your body's conserved all these low-level, fast operating circuits. And so you're a simple machine and a sort of complex machine and an extremely complex machine, and then something that's so complex that you can't even think about it as a machine. And you're all those things at the same time. And there's Swanson's take on how the motor system and the hypothalamus are integrated. So it's quite nice. He shows that the hypothalamic controller, so that's one of the circuits that we've been talking about that are responsible for a basic motivated state, gets sensory input, behavioral state input, that's about the body, and input from the cerebral hemispheres. Hypothetically, that's thought or voluntary action, plan, something like that. And then it has output to the motor pattern initiator, the generators, and the motor neuron pools, and then you act. Lovely. It's a beautiful, beautiful model. And so you can see that it maps very nicely onto that, with the sort of higher order levels of the hierarchy of sensory motor framing associated with cognitive abstractions, and the lowest levels associated with the sorts of things that you do with your spine. And this, I flipped this upside down here because I've been very interested in how people get traumatized, and it's easier to think of trauma when you flip the thing, because once you develop the higher order abstractions cortically, you know, you say, well, I'm a good person, let's say, then that's sort of, the fact that you're a good person, or what constitutes good, starts to become a box, the box, within which all the things that are associated with it are put. It's one of the dangers of abstraction, right, and categorization, because if you couldn't think of yourself as a good or bad person, let's say you didn't have that capacity for that level of abstraction, which is like a binary abstraction, right? Good is, you know, 1 and bad is 0. So it's a really simple abstraction. And so if you do something that a good person wouldn't do, well, clearly you don't fit into the 1 category because a good person wouldn't do that, so maybe you fit into the 0 category. And that capacity for abstraction is also precisely the sort of thing that allows human beings to undermine themselves with thought. Because once you have that capacity for abstraction, you can make these ridiculous overgeneralizations. In fact, they're really simple. I'm not a good person, I'm a horrible person. It's like that's how someone who's really depressed thinks whenever anything goes wrong. And so it's the danger, the powerful danger of abstraction is that you can make a terrible mistake in overgeneralization. This is partly because, well, let's say, I don't know, you're out with your girlfriend and you flirt with someone else. So what does that say about your character? Well, she might think that puts you in the 0 category, like now, right? You're not a good person. It's like, well, it's complicated. Is that true? Do you belong in that 0 category? She might treat you like that for a week or two. I mean, should you be taking yourself apart completely because you've made that error? Or should you seek farther down the chain of abstractions for a more specific mistake? Or should she help you do that? It's like, well, you're not a complete 0, you're more like a, 0.1. She could help you figure out exactly where in your personality hierarchy you have this fault, assuming that it's a fault. Maybe it's an indication that the relationship is over. Who knows? So